The house was dead silent until the baby monitor whispered my name from an empty nursery. On today's episode of The Wander's Tales, we dive where quiet courage prevails. Hidden truths and hearts so bold, stories of fear left untold. If this calls to you, don't delay, subscribe, tap the bell, and stay with us. Thank you. The sun was dipping below the Ngong Hills, casting long, bruised shadows across the manicured lawns of the estate, but inside the house, the light seemed to have died hours ago. Zari stepped through the heavy mahogany door, the click of her heels sounding like a gunshot in the oppressive stillness of the foyer. Usually, the house met her with the chaotic symphony of a life in motion, the rhythmic thumping of a washing machine, the distant hum of the television, or the soft, melodic babble of Amara in her playpen. But tonight, the air felt thick and sterile, as if the oxygen itself had been vacuumed out. She dropped her keys on the console table, expecting to hear Kojo call out from the kitchen about the dinner he'd started, yet the only sound was the low, electric thrum of the refrigerator. Panic didn't arrive all at once. It began as a cold trickled down her spine as she moved from the kitchen to the living room, finding them eerily pristine. The throw pillows were perfectly fluffed, the dining table was clear of the usual baby bottles and stray pacifiers, and the silence was so absolute it felt like a physical weight pressing against her eardrums. Then, through the heavy quiet, a sound emerged from the upper floor, a jagged, electronic rasp that made her heart seize. It was the baby monitor sitting on the edge of the granite countertop, its green light blinking like a rhythmic, mocking eye. From its tiny speaker came a sound that shouldn't have been possible in an empty house. A low, gravelly intake of breath, followed by a whisper that carried the unmistakable cadence of her own name, drifting through the plastic casing like a ghost in the wires. She stood frozen, her hand hovering over the cold stone of the counter, her mind racing through a dozen logical explanations that all fell short of the chilling reality. The voice wasn't Kojo's, nor was it the high-pitched coo of their daughter. It was a sound filtered through layers of static and malice, a sequence of syllables that felt intimate yet entirely alien. Zari. It hissed again, the S dragging out into a needle-fine point of sound that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of her bones. She forced her feet to move, driven by a primal maternal instinct that overrode the screaming alarm in her brain, and began to ascend the stairs, her breath coming in shallow, ragged bursts. The staircase, usually a brief transition between the public and private spheres of her life, felt like an endless gauntlet of shadows. Every portrait on the wall, their wedding in Naivasha, the trip to the Mara, the first photo of them holding Amara at the clinic, seemed to watch her with painted, judging eyes. As she reached the landing, the monitor in the nursery upstairs crackled in response to her movement, the feedback loop creating a high-pitched whine that set her teeth on edge. The house felt like it was expanding, the hallway stretching into a dark, yawning throat, and the air grew inexplicably colder with every step she took toward the nursery door. She was a woman of logic, a high court advocate who dealt in facts and evidence. But as she reached for the brass handle of the baby's room, the facts of her life felt like they were dissolving into the static of that whispering monitor. The nursery was a tomb of soft pastels and broken promises, bathed in the eerie, artificial glow of a street lamp filtering through the white lace curtains. Zari lunged for the crib, her hands grasping at the air where she expected to find the warm, solid weight of her daughter, but her fingers met only the smooth, taut surface of the fitted sheet. The room was a masterpiece of absence. Amara's favorite stuffed elephant sat squarely in the center of the rug, and the diaper bag was missing from its usual hook behind the door. She spun around, her eyes darting to the corner where Kojo's leather loafers usually sat discarded, but the floor was bare. It was then that her gaze fell upon the large, framed wedding photograph that sat on the dresser, a candid shot of them laughing under a canopy of acacia trees. With a trembling hand, she reached out to touch the glass, and a jolt of pure, visceral terror shot through her. The photograph was hot, not just warm from the sun, but radiating a feverish, internal heat as if the figures trapped within the emulsion were physically burning. The glass felt like it had been sitting in a kiln, the warmth seeping into her skin, a terrifying physical remnant of a presence that had only just departed. It was a sensory contradiction that defied the laws of the physical world. An empty, cold room containing a photograph that pulsed with the heat of a living body. The monitor on the changing table hissed again, the static clearing for a fraction of a second to reveal a sound like rustling dry leaves. "I told you I'd come back for her," the voice murmured, more distinct now, carrying a heavy, coastal accent that Zari didn't recognize but felt she should. She backed away from the heated photograph, her breath hitching in her chest, as she realized the shoes were gone not because Kojo had left in a hurry, but because he had methodically erased himself from the immediate environment. She checked the wardrobe. His suits were still hanging in stiff, silent rows, but his everyday essentials, the things that made him a person rather than a collection of clothes, were vanished. She felt like she was standing in a museum dedicated to a life she no longer possessed. She moved back to the crib, her mind screaming for a sign, a footprint, a spilled bottle. Anything to prove that this wasn't a hallucination. She pressed her palm into the center of the crib mattress, and her blood ran cold. The foam was still compressed, a deep, circular dent marking exactly where Amara's head had rested moments ago. The fibers of the sheet were still rising, slowly reclaiming their shape, proving that the child had been plucked from the bed only seconds before Zari had walked through the front door. The house was a trap of timing, a choreographed disappearance designed to leave her just enough evidence to know she had missed them by a heartbeat, leaving her alone with the whispering machine and the heat of a memory that was beginning to burn her fingers. The nursery air grew thick with the smell of ozone, the kind that precedes a massive rift in a Kenyan thunderstorm, but the sky outside remained a taunting, clear obsidian. Zari clutched the railing of the crib, her knuckles white against the dark wood, as the baby monitor on the changing table began to hum with a renewed, malevolent energy. The static wasn't just noise anymore. It was rhythmic, a digital heartbeat that seemed to synchronize with her own frantic pulse. Then, the voice returned, shedding its previous whisper for a tone that was chillingly melodic, almost a chant. "I told you I'd come back for her, Zari. You thought the distance between the coast and the city was enough to bury a debt, but the sea has a long memory." The words felt like physical blows, each one stripping away a layer of the curated, upper-middle-class identity she had built so carefully in this gated community. She stared at the monitor, half expecting it to bleed. The voice was older than the machine, a raspy, salt-worn sound that carried the weight of the Indian Ocean's depths. It wasn't Kojo's voice, yet it possessed an intimacy that suggested it knew the layout of her soul. She reached out to switch the device off, but as her finger grazed the plastic, a spark of blue static jumped to her skin, leaving a stinging burn and a metallic taste in her mouth. The monitor didn't die. It only laughed, a dry, rattling sound that echoed off the designer wallpaper and the silent, empty shelves that used to hold Amara's storybooks. The shadows in the room seemed to detach themselves from the corners, stretching toward the center of the floor like ink spilled on a white cloth. Zari backed away, her mind frantically cataloging the inconsistencies of the night, the missing shoes, the scorching photograph, and now this impossible broadcast. She felt a sudden, desperate need to be in the light, to prove that the world outside still functioned on the laws of physics and common sense. She stumbled into the hallway, flicking every switch she passed, but the high-end LED fixtures flickered and groaned, casting a strobe-like effect that made the corridor feel like a sequence of disjointed memories. The house was no longer a sanctuary. It had become an experimental chamber designed to test the limits of her sanity. Every time she glanced back at the nursery door, the monitor's voice would rise in volume, a cacophony of overlapping whispers that sounded like a dozen people standing just behind her, all speaking at once in a language that was almost Swahili, almost Giriama, but twisted into something ancient and unrecognizable. "She isn't yours to keep." The voices harmonized, a terrifying choir of static that vibrated the very floorboards beneath her feet. She realized, then, that she wasn't just looking for her daughter. She was being hunted by a past she had never fully acknowledged, a shadow that had finally caught up to the bright lights of Nairobi. When the police finally arrived, the flashing blue and red lights of the patrol car felt like a mockery of the darkness Zari was drowning in. Two officers, weary-eyed and smelling of stale coffee and the city's exhaust, walked through the house with a practiced, bureaucratic indifference that made her want to scream. They moved through the rooms like they were checking for a plumbing leak rather than a stolen life. The lead officer, a man named Mwangi with a heavy mustache and a clipboard that seemed to be his only weapon against the world's chaos, shook his head as he dusted the mahogany doorframe for prints. "There is no forced entry, madam," he said, his voice flat and devoid of the urgency Zari felt in every fiber of her being. "The locks are sophisticated, the alarm system was never tripped, and the CCTV at the main gate shows your husband's car leaving at 5:15 p.m. with a child in the back. To us, this looks like a domestic dispute, not a kidnapping." He didn't see the way the air in the nursery still shimmered with a ghostly heat, nor did he notice the way the light bulbs seemed to dim whenever he stepped near the crib. To the law, a husband taking his child was a civil matter, a messy footnote in a divorce that hadn't happened yet. They saw a woman in distress, not a woman whose reality was being rewritten by an invisible hand. Zari led them back into the nursery, her hand trembling as she pointed at the crib. "Look at the mattress," she demanded, her voice cracking with the strain of 1,000 unasked questions. "The police manual says look for evidence of presence. The mattress is still dented. It hasn't popped back up in 3 hours. How is that possible if no one is sitting there?" Officer Mwangi leaned over the railing, his shadow falling across the small, circular depression in the center of the foam. He poked it with a gloved finger, and for a second, a look of genuine confusion crossed his face as the material resisted his touch, remaining stubbornly sunken as if an invisible weight of 20 pounds was still resting there. But the moment passed, and he straightened his uniform, his face hardening back into a mask of professional skepticism. "Foam wears out, madam. It's a humid night. Materials behave strangely." He ignored the fact that the house was climate-controlled and that the mattress was a top-of-the-line import designed for durability. He didn't want to see the impossible, because the impossible required paperwork he wasn't prepared to file. They left her with a card and a patronizing pat on the shoulder, telling her to call if he sends a ransom note, leaving Zari alone once more in a house that was legally empty but spiritually crowded. The dent in the mattress remained, a silent, defiant proof that Amara, or something pretending to be her, was still occupying the space she had been taken from. The silence that followed the departure of the police was more deafening than the sirens had been. Zari sat on the floor of the hallway, her back against the cold plaster, listening to the house breathe. Every creak of the settling timber sounded like a footstep. Every whistle of the wind through the vents sounded like a child's sigh. Her eyes were fixed on the nursery door, which stood ajar, a sliver of darkness beckoning her back into the room she now feared most. Then a new sound cut through the quiet, a muffled, rhythmic vibration, followed by a bright, tinny melody that she knew all too well. It was Kojo's phone, the one he used for his private consultancy work, playing a ringtone she had teased him about 100 times. But the sound wasn't coming from his bedside table or the pockets of the suits she had checked. It was coming from inside the nursery, specifically from the heavy, white lacquer drawer where they kept the extra blankets and Amara's baptismal gown. She scrambled to her feet, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Kojo never went anywhere without that phone. It was his lifeline to his clients, his digital shadow. The fact that it was here, ringing in a locked drawer in a room the police had just searched, felt like a deliberate breadcrumb left by a monster. She reached the drawer and tugged at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was jammed, or perhaps locked from the inside, a physical impossibility that she no longer had the luxury of questioning. The ringing continued, persistent and demanding, the vibrations making the entire dresser rattle against the wall. Zari grabbed a heavy glass paperweight from the changing table, a gift from Kojo, a sphere of clear crystal with a single red rose preserved inside, and smashed it against the wooden lip of the drawer. The wood splintered with a sickening crack, smelling of fresh pine and something metallic, like old blood. As the front of the drawer fell away, she saw the phone lying atop a pile of lace. Its screen was a brilliant, blinding white, illuminating the nursery with a cold, sterile light. There were no caller ID details, just a string of zeros that scrolled endlessly across the display. The phone wasn't just ringing, it was pulsing, the plastic casing feeling hot to the touch, echoing the heat of the wedding photograph downstairs. She reached for it, her hand hovering over the glass, terrified of what she would hear if she answered, and even more terrified of what would happen if she didn't. This was the umbilical cord to the nightmare, the only bridge left between her empty house and the man who had stolen her life. Before Zari's fingers could even make contact with the glowing screen, the phone went silent. The ringing stopped mid-note, but the screen didn't go dark. Instead, the accept icon slid across the display of its own accord, and the speakerphone activated with a sharp, electronic pop. Zari froze, her hand suspended in the air, as the nursery was filled with the sound of the world outside, but not the world of Nairobi. She heard the unmistakable, rhythmic roar of the ocean, the crashing of heavy surf against jagged coral, and the high-pitched whistle of a coastal gale whipping through palm fronds. It was the sound of the north coast, of the hidden coves near Kilifi, where the water was deep and the legends were older than the Republic. Through the roar of the sea, she heard breathing, not the panicked gasps of a kidnapper, but a slow, rhythmic, almost meditative inhalation and exhalation. It was the sound of a man who had finally reached his destination and was waiting for the world to catch up. "Kojo," she whispered, her voice a fragile thing that seemed to be swallowed by the ocean, sounds coming from the tiny speaker. "Kojo, where is she? Where's my daughter?" The breathing on the other end hitched, and for a second, the sound of the wind died down, replaced by a low, guttural vibration. It wasn't a voice at first, but a series of clicks and whistles, the linguistic markers of the deep coast that Kojo had always claimed he didn't know. Then, a voice that sounded like Kojo's, but stripped of his Nairobi polish, stripped of his corporate inflection, spoke. She was never a daughter, Zari. She was a deposit, and the term is up. The line crackled with a burst of static so violent it made the phone dance across the lace in the drawer. "Listen to the wind, Zari. Can you hear the difference? In the city, the wind just moves the trash. Here, the wind moves the soul." The call ended abruptly, the screen turning a deep, bruised purple before cutting to black. The nursery felt suddenly, violently empty, the silence returning with the force of a vacuum. Zari realized with a sickening jolt that the man she had shared a bed with for 5 years was a stranger wearing a husband's skin. The phone in the drawer was a relic of a life he had kept partitioned away, a digital ghost that had just informed her that her motherhood was merely a temporary lease on a soul that belonged to the sea. Zari remained on the floor of the nursery, the broken drawer a jagged wound in the room's perfection, when the baby monitor crackled back to life. But the voice that emerged this time was different. It had lost its sharp, threatening edge, replaced by a hollow, desperate vulnerability that was almost more terrifying. It was the voice of a man pleading for his life, or perhaps his soul. "You promised you'd forgive me." The monitor sobbed, the static now sounding like the soft patter of rain on a tin roof. "You said if I brought her back, the debt would be wiped. You said I could come home." The voice was unmistakably Kojo's now, but it sounded younger, thinner, as if it were a recording from a decade ago. It was the sound of a man who had been backed into a corner by something he couldn't outrun. Zari crawled toward the monitor, her heart breaking even as her mind screamed for caution. This was the man she loved, the man who had held her hand through 18 hours of labor, or what she thought was labor. The memory of the hospital felt suddenly hazy, the details blurring into a fog of medication and exhaustion. Had she really given birth, or had she merely woken up with a child and a story she was too happy to question? "I'm here, Kojo," she whispered to the plastic device, her tears blurring the blinking green LED. "I'm in the house. Just tell me where you are. I'll forgive anything. Just bring her back." The monitor responded with a burst of white noise that sounded like a scream cut short. The pleading voice shifted again, warping into a low, mocking hum. Forgiveness is for the living, Zari. Silas doesn't want forgiveness. He wants the balance. The name Silas sent a jolt of cold through her. It was a name she had seen once, years ago, on an old, yellowed piece of mail that had arrived at their first apartment, which Kojo had snatched away and burned before she could see the return address. He had told her it was a mistake, a ghost from a previous tenant, but now it was the name the monitor used to define the man she thought she knew. The shift in the voice suggested a psychological fracture, a man being torn between the life he had built in the city and the shadows he had left behind at the coast. The monitor wasn't just a communication device anymore. It was a window into a crumbling psyche, broadcasting the battle for the identity of the man who held her daughter's life in his hands. Driven by a sudden, frantic clarity, Zari left the nursery and ran to their master bedroom. On the wall above their bed hung their wedding vows, handwritten on expensive parchment and encased in a heavy, ornate gold frame. They were the centerpiece of their perfect life, the promises they had made to each other in front of 100 witnesses in a garden in Karen. She tore the frame off the wall, the glass shattering against the bedside table, and began to rip at the thick cardboard backing. Her fingers bled as she clawed through the layers of the frame, driven by a hunch she couldn't explain. She remembered the way Kojo had insisted on framing the vows himself, the way he had spent hours in the garage, his movements secretive and tense. Behind the parchment, pressed flat against the velvet lining of the frame, she found a single sheet of thin, blue airmail paper. It was covered in a cramped, frantic script that looked nothing like the elegant hand Kojo used for his legal documents. It was a letter addressed to no one, or perhaps to the man he was trying to kill inside himself. The note was a confession written in the shorthand of a man who knew his time was running out. "The child is the currency." The first line read, the ink smudged as if by a trembling hand. "They don't want money. They want the bloodline returned. I took her from the clinic in Malindi because I thought I could cheat the tides. I thought if I gave her a name and a life in the city, she would become real. But the shadow is growing, and Silas is tired of hiding." Zari felt the room tilt on its axis. The vows they had lived by were a shroud for a theft. The note was signed with a flourish that looked like a hook, the name Silas written in bold, aggressive strokes that seemed to vibrate on the page. She realized then that her entire marriage had been a long con against fate, a desperate attempt by a man named Silas to buy a second chance with a stolen child. The note wasn't a message of love. It was a ledger of a debt that was finally being called in, and the price of the interest was her daughter's future. She looked at the signature, the ink still smelling faintly of salt and iron, and knew that the man she was waiting for was no longer the man she had married. The name Silas felt like a key turning in a lock she hadn't known existed. As Zari stared at the signature, memories began to resurface, unbidden and sharp. She remembered a weekend in Wata, early in their relationship, when an old man at a fish market had stopped dead in his tracks upon seeing Kojo. The old man hadn't called him Kojo. He had whispered Silas with a look of pure, unadulterated terror before scurrying away into the shadows of the stalls. Kojo had laughed it off, calling the man a madman addled by the sun, and Zari had believed him because believing him was easier than questioning the perfect man she had found. Now, she realized that everyone in his past knew the truth, and she was the only one who had been living in the fiction. Silas wasn't just a name. It was a history of violence and maritime smuggling that stretched back to the old ports of the Swahili coast. He had been a fixer for things that weren't meant to be fixed, a man who navigated the gray areas between the physical world and the superstitions of the deep water. She went to his home office, a room she rarely entered, and began to tear through his desk with a feral intensity. She bypassed the tax returns, the property deeds, and the corporate contracts, looking for the hidden seams in his life. She found a false bottom in a drawer of vintage fountain pens, and inside, a leather-bound journal that smelled of Old Spice and damp earth. The entries were dates and coordinates, lists of cargo that included things that shouldn't be listed, charms, relics, and transfers of essence. The deeper she read, the more she realized that Kojo, Silas, had been a bridge for things that wanted to cross over into the modern world. He had tried to retire, to become a man of the city, but you don't just walk away from the entities that rule the tides. The journal ended abruptly 6 months before Amara was born, with a single, chilling entry. The sea demands a vessel. If I cannot provide the gold, I must provide the blood. I will find a way to make it legal. I will find a way to make her ours. The Kojo, she knew, was a masterpiece of performance art, a shield built to protect a man from a maritime debt that had finally come to collect. The legal way Kojo had mentioned in his journal led Zari to a loose floorboard beneath the heavy Persian rug in his office. She pried it up with a letter opener, her heart thumping in her ears like a tribal drum. Inside was a small, fireproof safe. The code was a series of numbers she recognized instantly. The date they had met at a charity gala in Nairobi. The safe clicked open, revealing a stack of documents that felt cold to the touch. These weren't the colorful, celebratory birth certificates they had framed for the nursery. These were official-looking papers from a defunct clinic in a remote part of the Tana River Delta. As she fanned them out, she saw the truth laid bare in clinical, heartless detail. There was no record of Zari's pregnancy, because there had been no pregnancy. There were only acquisition records signed by a doctor whose name had been struck from the medical register years ago. The papers described a child born to a surrogate of the sea, a phrase that made Zari's stomach churn with a primal dread. The adoption papers were even worse. They were meticulously forged, bearing the stamps of government offices that didn't exist and the signatures of officials who had been dead for a decade. Every document was a lie, a carefully constructed paper trail designed to give a stolen child a pedigree. But beneath the forgeries was a single, genuine document, a contract of custodial transfer between Silas and a group simply referred to as the Keepers of the Deep. The contract stated that the child would be held in trust for 5 years, after which the principal would be returned to the source. Amara had just turned 5 months old, but the contract wasn't about her age. It was about the 5-year anniversary of the debt Silas had incurred. Zari looked at the dates and realized with a scream that she could no longer hold back. The 5-year mark was tonight. The midnight of their wedding anniversary was the deadline for the return of the vessel. She wasn't a mother. She was a caretaker for a supernatural collateral, and the time for the repossession had arrived at the exact moment she had walked through the door. Holding the forged papers, Zari felt a profound sense of ontological vertigo. If Amara wasn't legally hers, if she hadn't even come from her own body, then what was the nature of the love she felt? The memories of the late-night feedings, the scent of baby powder, and the feel of Amara's tiny hand gripping her thumb, were these just biochemical illusions triggered by a master manipulator? She looked at the adoption papers again, and the ink seemed to shift and crawl like tiny black insects. The realization that the baby was never legally theirs was a physical blow, but the spiritual implication was even more devastating. She had been an unwitting accomplice in a cosmic theft. Silas hadn't just stolen a child. He had stolen a life for her to inhabit, turning her into the respectable wife of a man who was essentially a ghost. Her grief was tainted by a burgeoning rage, a rage at the man who had lied to her, but also at the universe that allowed such a cruel exchange. She realized then that the police who had visited earlier were likely part of the fiction. They hadn't seen the evidence because they weren't meant to. The entire estate, the security, the life she lived, was a bubble maintained by Silas's fading influence. As the influence waned, the bubble was popping, letting the real world and the darker world beneath it seep in. She went to the kitchen and grabbed a box of matches, her hand steady now with a cold, hard purpose. She took the papers to the sink and struck a match. The adoption papers didn't burn like normal paper. They hissed and sputtered, releasing a thick, black smoke that smelled of rotting seaweed and ancient incense. The flames were a strange, flickering blue, and as the papers turned to ash, she felt a slight lifting of the weight in the house. But the heat remained, and the monitor in the nursery began to scream, a high, piercing wail of a child in distress. The destruction of the papers had triggered a reaction, a signal to the keepers that the contract was being contested. She realized that by burning the lies, she was finally inviting the truth to the front door. The smell of the burning papers triggered a vivid, sensory flashback to a trip they had taken to Mombasa 3 years prior. It was supposed to be a second honeymoon, a chance to reconnect after the stress of their failed attempts to conceive. Zari remembered Kojo taking her to a secluded stretch of beach near Tiwi, far from the tourist resorts. The moon had been a silver sliver, and the tide was further out than she had ever seen it. Kojo had told her to wait by the fire while he went to speak with an old friend about a business venture. He had returned an hour later, dripping wet and shivering, but with a look of triumph she had never seen before. He had held a small, ornate wooden box, and he had whispered to her, "Our prayers have been answered, Zari. We're going to have a child. I've made the arrangements." She had been so blinded by her desire for a family that she hadn't asked what was in the box or why his skin felt like ice for a week afterward. In the flashback, she remembered the way the water had seemed to pull away from him in fear, the way the crabs had scurried into the shadows as he passed. She remembered the low, rhythmic chanting that had drifted over the dunes, a sound she had dismissed as a distant celebration but now recognized as the same cadence she had heard on the baby monitor. The adoption hadn't happened in a clinic. It had happened on that beach in the space between the tides. The doctor had been an old woman with eyes like milky pearls who had touched Zari's stomach and whispered a blessing that felt like a curse. Everything she thought was a miracle of modern medicine or divine intervention was actually a transaction. As the memory faded, Zari stood in her high-end kitchen in Nairobi, the ash of the papers swirling in the sink, and realized that she had been a participant in a ritual she didn't understand. The slow build of her life had been a countdown to this night, and the love she had nurtured was the fuel for a fire that was now consuming her home. She looked at the clock, 11:30 p.m. The final act was beginning. The luxury of the Nairobi suburb began to dissolve as a supernatural frost crept across the windows, etching crystalline patterns of salt and ice against the glass despite the equatorial night. Zari could see her own breath now, a series of ghost-white plumes that hung in the air like silent witnesses to her descent. The high-end smart thermostat on the wall flickered wildly, its digital display spiraling down into numbers that shouldn't exist in a tropical climate, finally settling on a chilling 0 degrees Celsius. The house wasn't just losing heat. It was being drained of its vital energy, the very warmth of her memories being sucked into the vacuum left by Amar's absence. She wrapped her silk robe tighter around her shivering frame, but the cold felt internal, a freezing of the marrow that no fabric could reach. Every surface she touched, the Italian marble of the counters, the velvet of the sofa, felt like it had been submerged in the deep, lightless trenches of the Indian Ocean. The silence was no longer empty. It was heavy with the pressure of the depths, making her ears pop as if she were sinking miles below the surface of the earth. From the baby monitor, a new sound began to filter through the static, replacing the whispers with a haunting, melodic chime. It was a lullaby, but not the Western nursery rhyme she had played for Amar on her phone. This was a tune played on a nyatatai, the strings plucked with a deliberate, sorrowful precision that resonated in the hollow spaces of the house. The melody was cyclical, a narrative loop that seemed to tell a story of a tide that goes out and never returns. As the music played, the shadows in the hallway began to undulate in time with the rhythm, swaying like kelp in an underwater current. Zari found herself humming along to a song she had never heard, the notes tasting like salt and copper in her mouth. The monitor didn't just broadcast the sound. It seemed to exhale it, filling the room with a fine, briny mist that dampened the carpets and made the air taste of ancient, unwashed secrets. The modern house was being reclaimed by a primitive, aquatic force, and the lullaby was the siren song of its final approach. By 10 p.m., the line between reality and hallucination had become a jagged, indistinguishable blur. When a heavy knock sounded at the door, Zari didn't run to open it. She stood in the center of the foyer, staring at the wood as if it were a predator's mouth. It was Officer Mwangi again, but he looked different. His uniform was disheveled, and his eyes lacked the bureaucratic dullness from before. He didn't ask to come in. He pushed past her, his gaze darting around the room with a frantic suspicion. "We found your husband's car, madam," he said, but his voice sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a well. It was abandoned near the bypass. Empty. But the forensics team, they found things. They found sea sand in the upholstery, gallons of it, and they found your fingerprints on a bottle of sedatives that shouldn't be in a house with a baby. He looked at her not as a victim, but as a suspect in a play he didn't understand. To the outside world, Zari was a woman who had cracked under the pressure of a fraudulent life, a mother who had perhaps erased the evidence of her husband's lies. Zari tried to speak, to tell him about the monitor and the heat in the photograph, but the words felt like dry sand in her throat. She realized with a terrifying clarity that Silas had staged this perfectly, not just the disappearance, but the narrative of her own guilt. If she was the suspect, no one would look for the keepers of the deep. She saw herself through Mwangi's eyes, a woman standing in a freezing house, surrounded by shattered glass and burnt papers, talking about whispering machines. The psychological weight of the gaslighting was more suffocating than the cold. She began to laugh, a jagged, hysterical sound that echoed off the cold marble. And for a moment, she saw Mwangi flinch as if she had struck him. He backed away, reaching for his radio, but the device only emitted the same Nyatata lullaby that was playing upstairs. The look of pure, unadulterated terror on the officer's face as he realized the music was coming from his own equipment was the final snap in Zari's sanity. She wasn't just losing her daughter. She was being deleted from the world of the living, replaced by a ghost story. After Mwangi fled the house, leaving the front door swinging open to the night, the monitor's frequency shifted again. It was no longer Kojo, or Silas, speaking. It was a woman's voice, clear and resonant, devoid of the static that had plagued the earlier broadcasts. "He told you she was a gift, didn't he?" the voice asked, and Zari recognized the tonal quality from her coastal flashback, the woman with eyes like pearls. "He told you he found a way to bridge the worlds." But Silas always was a thief of shadows. The monitor's screen flickered to life, showing not the nursery, but a grainy, sepia-toned image of a woman standing on a pier, holding a bundle wrapped in white lace. It was a memory being projected into the present, a digital haunting. The woman in the image looked like a younger, more exhausted version of the woman from the beach. She spoke to the camera, or to whoever was recording, with a weary resignation. "A life for a life, Silas. That was the trade. You took my peace to buy your prestige. Now, the ocean wants its reflection back." The woman from the past wasn't a mistress or a secret wife. She was the source. Zari watched, mesmerized and horrified, as the image on the monitor began to bleed into the reality of the room. The smell of the pier, the rotting fish, the salt-slicked wood, the diesel fumes filled the nursery. She realized that the adoption wasn't a legal or even a standard illegal transaction. It was a spiritual displacement. Silas had taken a child that belonged to the keepers, a child born of a different lineage, and tried to force it into the mold of a Nairobi middle-class upbringing. The woman on the screen was the biological mother, a woman who had been part of the debt Silas had tried to outrun. The monitor was acting as a bridge, allowing the grief of a woman from the coast to infect the heart of the city. Zari reached out to touch the screen, and for a moment, her fingers felt the rough, damp texture of the woman's lace shawl. The ghost in the machine was the truth of the collateral. Amara wasn't just a child. She was a stolen piece of the sea's soul, and the woman on the screen was the one who had finally come to collect. The philosophical undertones of Silas's betrayal began to settle in Zari's mind like sediment in a glass of water. She understood now that his love for her, while perhaps genuine in its intensity, was a selfish act of preservation. He had used her, her respectability, her legal mind, her perfect life, as a camouflage to hide from the entities he had offended. Every kiss, every "I love you," Every plan for the future was a brick in a wall he was building against the inevitable tide. The debt wasn't just about a child. It was about the balance of nature. Silas had lived a life of fixing things that were meant to remain broken, and Amara was his final, greatest fix. He had loved the idea of a family enough to steal one, but he hadn't loved the child enough to protect her from the consequences of his own history. The letting go he had spoken of on the phone wasn't an act of sacrifice. It was a final, desperate payment to save his own skin. Zari realized that in the world Silas navigated, a life for a life was the only currency that held value. To keep his own soul, he had to return the one he had borrowed. The bloodline returned, mentioned in the note, wasn't about genetics. It was about the restoration of an equilibrium he had disrupted. She felt a cold, hard clarity replace her grief. She had been the vessel for his respectability, just as Amara had been the vessel for his debt. The anger that rose in her now was no longer hysterical. It was the focused, lethal rage of a woman who had been turned into a pawn in a cosmic game of checkers. She looked at the ring on her finger, the diamond that sparkled in the dim light, and saw it for what it was, a shackle forged in the fires of another person's misery. The debt was due, and while Silas was prepared to pay with the child, Zari was beginning to realize that she was the only one who could truly break the cycle by refusing to play the part of the grieving widow. As the clock ticked toward 11:55 p.m., the house began to physically react to the approaching deadline. The walls seemed to pulse, the plaster expanding and contracting like a giant architectural lung. The sound of the breathing became audible, a low, rhythmic huffing that vibrated the floorboards and made the chandeliers sway. The air was so thick with salt that it stung Zari's eyes, and the fine mist from the monitor had turned into a literal dampness that coated every surface. She stood in the foyer, the front door still wide, open to the Nairobi night, but the world outside the threshold looked like a distorted reflection in a funhouse mirror. The streetlights were dim, flickering orbs, and the sound of a city had been completely replaced by the roar of the surf. It was as if the house had been physically transported to the edge of a cliff overlooking the Indian Ocean, the two realities overlapping in a violent, unstable fusion. Zari held the crystal paperweight, the one she had used to break the drawer, as a makeshift weapon, though she knew it was useless against the forces gathering in the shadows. She felt a strange sense of anticipation, a liminal state where she was neither the woman she was yesterday nor the victim Silas expected her to be. The monitor in the nursery gave one final, piercing cry, a sound that was half baby, half seabird, and then went silent. The green light turned a steady, ominous red. The house held its breath. The breathing stopped. The Nyatatai music reached a final, discordant crescendo, and then snapped into a silence, so absolute it felt like a physical blow. The midnight watch was over. The time for the transfer had arrived. She watched the shadows at the end of the driveway, waiting for the figure she knew was coming, her heart a steady, defiant beat against the silence of the dying house. The electronic gate at the edge of the property groaned, the heavy steel sliding open with a sound of grinding bone. A lone figure emerged from the darkness of the driveway, framed by the pale, sickly moonlight that seemed to follow him like a spotlight. It was Kojo, no, it was Silas. He walked with a heavy, rhythmic limp she had never noticed before, his expensive suit soaked through with seawater, clinging to his frame like a second, darker skin. He wasn't carrying a child. His hands were empty, his fingers curled into loose, defeated fists. As he crossed the threshold of the house, the breathing of the walls intensified, a welcoming moan from the structure itself. He stopped 10 feet away from Zari, his face a mask of exhaustion and salt-caked grief. He didn't look like a kidnapper or a monster. He looked like a man who had just drowned and hadn't realized it yet. "Where is she?" Zari asked, her voice steady, echoing in the hollowed-out foyer. Silas didn't answer immediately. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, velvet box, the kind that holds a ring. He opened it, but instead of a new piece of jewelry, it contained a small, gold band Zari had bought for Amara's future, a heirloom she had hoped to pass down. The ring was wet, dripping a thick, black fluid onto the marble floor. "I kept my promise," he whispered, his voice a rasp of sand and regret. "I love her enough to let her go. She's back where the tides don't hurt, Zari. She's back with the keepers. It was the only way to keep the house standing. It was the only way to keep you." The realization that he had sacrificed the child not just for himself, but to save the life he had built with Zari, was the final, sickening twist. He had traded their daughter for the continuation of a lie. Silas moved toward her, his hand reaching out as if to stroke her cheek, but Zari recoiled, the crystal paperweight raised like a shield. "You didn't love her," she spat, the words cutting through the briny air. "You loved the silence. You loved the fact that you could buy a life and return it when a bill came due. You aren't a father, Silas. You're a broker." He stopped, his hand dropping to his side, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of the man she had married, the Kojo who had laughed in the sun. But it was a fleeting ghost, swallowed by the cold, dark reality of the man who stood before her. He looked down at his empty hands, the salt water dripping from his sleeves, forming a dark puddle on the white marble. "The ring is all that's left," he said, his voice hollow. "A token of the contract closed. They don't take the gold. They only take the promise." He stepped closer, and this time, Zari didn't move. She saw the ring in the box. It wasn't just gold anymore. It was glowing with the same eerie, blue light she had seen in the burning papers. It was a brand, a mark of the transaction. Silas reached out and took her hand, his skin feeling like wet parchment. He slipped a second ring on her finger, next to her wedding band, a thin black wire that felt like a needle pricking her skin. "I loved her enough to let her go," he repeated, a mantra of self-delusion. "And I love you enough to leave." He leaned in and kissed her forehead, his lips as cold as the ice on the windows. The kiss tasted of salt and the end of the world. As he pulled away, the house gave one final, shuddering gasp, and the breathing stopped forever. The connection was severed. The debt was paid, and the empty hands of the man she loved were the final proof of the price of their perfect life. The front door didn't close. Silas simply walked out into the night, his figure dissolving into the mist of the driveway before he even reached the gate. As he vanished, the temperature in the house began to rise with an unnatural, sweltering speed. The ice on the windows melted into streaks of gray grime, and the salt on the walls turned into a fine, white powder that settled over everything like ash. Zari stood alone in the foyer, the two rings on her finger feeling like weights that would eventually pull her into the earth. The house was normal again. The smart thermostat clicked back to a comfortable 22 degrees Celsius. The lights stopped flickering, and the distant hum of the city returned. But the silence was different now. It wasn't the silence of an empty house. It was the silence of a grave. Amara was gone, Kojo was gone, and Zuri was a name written on a contract that had been fulfilled. She walked back up to the nursery one last time. The baby monitor sat on the changing table, its red light fading back to a dull, harmless gray. She picked it up, expecting silence, but as she held it to her ear, she heard a final, faint sound. It wasn't a whisper or a lullaby. It was the sound of a heart beating, slow, steady, and deep like the pulse of the ocean itself. And then a tiny, familiar coo, the sound of Amara waking up from a nap. But the sound didn't come from a room. It came from inside Zari, a phantom vibration in her own chest. She looked at her reflection in the nursery window and saw not her own eyes, but the milky, pearl-like gaze of the woman from the coast. Silas had returned the child to the sea, but the sea had left a part of itself behind in her. The story didn't end with a departure. It ended with a transformation. Zari turned off the monitor, walked out of the room, and closed the door on the life she had known, ready to follow the sound of the heartbeat back to the coast. We think we're building a future, but sometimes we're just decorating a cage. My husband didn't leave. He just stopped pretending to be human. The sea took its due, and now I'm left with a heartbeat that isn't mine. Are you living a lie too?